This é o início da mensagem. The alarm cut through the marble lobby like a verdict. Red lights blinked against the polished stone, and the hum of conversation folded into a single sharp silence. People stopped mid-stride, coffee cups arrested in motion. Someone's phone chimed and went unanswered. A security guard pulled at the strap of a worn canvas bag, fingers efficient and unhesitant, while Noah Briggs stood by the fountain as if rooted to the spot, palms pressed to the seams of his jacket. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes in the back of his neck. Curiosity, suspicion, the small, hungry thrill that crowds take in watching someone else unease. Noah's bag was ordinary in the way that the lives of ordinary people are ordinary. Frayed at the corners, patched with a rectangle of duct tape. Cords of string tied around the zipper where the metal had long since split. Inside, beneath the thermos, beside a folded sketchbook and a packet of antiseptic bandages, lay the burned shoe. Its canvas blackened and stiff, rubber cracked at the sole. It was an artifact of a life that had other names and other dangers. To him, it was a relic, a proof, a thing that smelled faintly of old smoke when the lid was lifted. To the three people watching closest, an executive with a tailored coat, a man in an HR lanyard, and a woman with an expensive handbag, it was a suspicious object, flagged by scanners and protocols. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to open your bag," the security guard said, voice low but carrying. He had been trained for this, to sound both polite and unequivocal. Noah obeyed. The zipper fought but then gave, and the contents were quickly spread across the security table. A thermos, a pair of work gloves, Evan's drawing of a stick-figure superhero with a big smile, and the shoe, odd, singular, blackened like a small moon. It was a weird, private thing in a very public place. People made little rustles of disapproval. Someone laughed, a brittle, thoughtless sound. Noah felt his face heat. He'd worked the cleaning shifts at Lennox Group for 8 years. He was not invisible to everyone. Mr. Patel from procurement nodded when they met in the corridor. The woman who staffed the 9th floor restroom smiled at him when she saw him refill soap dispensers. But in the broad, anonymous sense of corporate life, he was accustomed to moving like a background object people failed to notice until it caused trouble. "Is this evidence?" someone whispered. Amelia Lennox, in the center of the ripple, had been walking toward the main doors, her coat unbuttoned to reveal a blouse that matched the cool determination in her jaw. She had pressing matters, investors, numbers, a meeting to mold a merger into reality. For 20 decades, she had been taught to read images like letters. A spotless lobby spoke to competence. A flagged bag spelled either negligence or threat. She watched, briefcase swinging at her hip, and at first she saw exactly what everyone else did. An anomaly, a potential scandal, something to be dealt with quickly so it wouldn't become an embarrassment in the press. "Sir?" the security supervisor called more sharply now, and Noah answered like someone hauled awake. He kept his voice steady, though his hand shook. He had learned to keep it steady. A 6-year-old on the other end of the day needed the steadiness of his voice more than he needed anyone's sympathy.
Evan's picture with the crooked cape and a caption, "Hero Dad," felt so tenderly ridiculous in that corporate shine. Noah smiled without humor as a guard lifted the shoe and turned it under the lights. A woman near the security table made a face, a crisp, involuntary expression of disgust. "Why would someone keep something like that?" she whispered, assuming that the blackened thing was evidence of theft, something taken and hidden away. Richard Chen stepped forward, his expression expertly neutral, but his eyes razor-sharp. He had the posture of appraisal, the small arrogance of a man who had spent a career reducing risk into percentages and reputations into bullet points. "We can't have unattended items," he said, and his voice carried authority. "We need to make sure this isn't a security risk. I'll inform HR and—" Amelia listened, the gears in her head folding the incident into the day's risk assessment. Protocol mattered. Image mattered. The company had, by her direction, and because reputation had been bought and paid for with hard hours and sharper words, no room for anything that smelled like irregularity. She saw Noah's profile, the worn lines of his jacket, the scar at the nape of his neck where hair curled irregularly. The scar was small. People carry reminders of accidents all the time. She saw the shoe, and, with no time for story, she saw only danger and a headline she could not afford. "Security will take a report," she said. The words should have been neutral, but something in the room read them as accusation. Heads inclined, murmurs rose. Noah felt the pressure of judgment like a physical shove. Someone snapped a photo. Another added it to a group chat labeled "Latest." He tried to say, "No, it's mine," but the words fell into a sea of polite, bureaucratic noise. The guard's hand lay on the registry tablet, and the cursor blinked accusingly between fields. Name, ID, purpose. Noah's ID number was typed. His shift was noted. People cross-referenced the face with the corporate database in their heads. Janitor, not an executive. Not relevant until suddenly very relevant. Noah stepped back, palms still to the bag. He felt every footstep a little louder than it should be, and the sound of his own breath became a foreign instrument. He thought of Evan, of the small apartment with chipped tile, and the nightly ritual of dinner and bedtime story.
He thought of how Evan had folded the drawing and tucked it into Noah's coat pocket that morning, pressing the crayon superhero into his palm and saying, "Put it where no one will take him, Daddy." He thought of the burned shoe and how, a week ago, he had still been taking it out at night and running it under the tap, remembering the smell, pressing his thumb along the charred fabric and thinking of the boy who had worn it before his small life got complicated. He would have explained if people had given him the space. But the crowd does not give space. It gives assumptions. Amelia paused now, in the center of the room, and something in her posture tightened. A board member's assistant was close enough to murmur into her ear, "We should escalate." And she heard the word escalate the way a surgeon hears the word complications. They could not have any shame on this floor. She had built a career in rooms exactly like this: clarity, action, containment. She allowed herself the kind of decision that in other circumstances would have been deferential. "We'll need a formal statement," she said. "If the bag is flagged, we will follow policy. Security, if there's anything—" The words were a lock turning in a heavy door, and Noah felt it slam. People shifted as if someone had nudged the room toward a more voyeuristic posture, as if now spectacle had joined curiosity. Someone whispered about taking things and suspicious items. A reporter, no more than a freelancer, but with a sharp lens, had her phone half raised,
capturing angles. The humiliation was not sudden. It was practical and accumulative. Noah folded his hands into fists so tight his knuckles paled. It was the humiliation that dug because it was public. It was the polite, corporate sort that pretended to be necessary and efficient while it stripped dignity. No one asked him his story. No one asked him why a burned shoe sat where a pedicure would not ever. He left when a supervisor directed him. He walked past the fountain, the splash of water mundane and incongruous. The janitorial cart smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and wet plaster dust. It was his workplace, his domain, and now it felt like a shield and a shroud. The city pressed against the building glass. Buses, cabs, people who were going to other jobs, other meetings, other lives. And Noah walked through the lobby that had suddenly been narrowed into a tableau of accusation. Outside, the winter air hit him like a slap. He took a breath that tasted like gasoline and old reminders. He had to go home. He had to tuck Evan into bed. He had to explain to a 6-year-old that grown-ups sometimes made wrong assumptions because they didn't know enough. He thought of the burned shoe in the light of the street lamp, a souvenir of a night when he had run into a collapsing building without thinking, when he had been younger and the world felt like something to be fixed by muscle and instinct. He had never wanted credit. There were other things inside Amelia, gaps, a kind of brittle forgetting in the crevices of memory. She knew of a house fire once that had been in the family papers, a warehouse in the outskirts where, as a child, she had been rescued. Images haunted her sometimes, like the idea of a dream whose edges had been blurred. Very few people in her life had explained it because it had been a complicated thing. And sometimes memory itself is like a ledger that deletes entries. Her mother, Eleanor Lennox, had full pockets of memory. Eleanor occupied her life like a book, pages thick with things people had said in the past, stories that could be summoned with a look, with the tap of a cane on marble. She had come downtown that day for a meeting with the charity arm, and had paused in the lobby only because the building had once meant something to her, a place where young Amelia had sprinted to avoid heat, where fear had hung in the air like a seasoning. Eleanor had seen the table with Noah's things spread across it. She had seen the shoe. Something in her hands, an authoritarian, familial instinct, tugged the shape of recognition straight into the center of her chest. For Eleanor, memory was not passive. It was a thing to be deployed in crises. She had stories saved like a general keeps maps. The burned shoe was not an anonymous object. She had held something like it in the past. The braided leather of another shoe turned to ash by the same fire that had almost taken a child. Her fingers remembered tactile details. The smell of smoke in the lobby surged through her like an echo of a day when she had stood at the edge of a warehouse and shouted names into heat. That afternoon, Eleanor stood by the executive elevators, not because she wanted to be dramatic, but because she needed proof. She watched Noah pass by in the corridor, cart in hand, moving through his job like a small, persistent tide. She watched him tuck something into his coat. Maybe it was Evan's drawing. Maybe it was a cloth to clean a counter. Her eyes landed on the slightly stooped way he carried himself and the flash of the scar at his neck. She felt the name of that night rise up from a pocket of memory she had kept folded like a letter in a drawer. Amelia found a reason to descend from her office, a talk with HR, a quick conversation with the board's counsel. The marble shone underfoot as she came down. She had rehearsed her statements to be precise and blame-averse. She wanted the company to be above reproach. There was a cold logic to formulation. The wrong PR bite could bleed out trust. Eleanor watched Amelia enter the lobby with a practiced eye. She had always been able to see her daughter as both an adult and a frightened child. The fire had taken more than just a childhood memory for Amelia. It had taken a simple file of precise recall. Eleanor had watched, in the days after that long-ago fire, as Amelia's small life was braided with an urge to control danger, to remove uncertainty from the world so it would not touch people again. It had turned in the adult Eleanor into a leader who mitigated visible threats and sometimes overlooked the quiet ones. Seeing Noah now, a man singled out and embarrassed, Eleanor felt a surge that was neither sentimental nor performative. It was a clarity like light through a window. The burned shoe belonged to the boy her daughter had been saved from years ago. The shoe, in its ordinary indignity, had been kept by Noah. He had not been a thief but a rescuer. He had been someone who had run into smoke and pulled a small child free, Amelia, from the teeth of a blaze. The idea was both astounding in its simplicity and devastating in the way it exposed a gap. Amelia had been spared the full memory of that night. She had been kept safe, yes, but the man who had given his safety to do it had been discarded in a lobby as a potential criminal. Eleanor moved like a woman about to correct a course. She lifted her cane with a hand that was steady enough, and Amelia saw her approach. For a moment, the lobby's noise reduced to a dull background thrum. The security guard looked uncomfortable. Richard looked focused on maintaining a perimeter of control. People formed a half-circle of expectation. Noah felt the subtle shift before the words. He had been taught to expect indifference. He had not expected recognition. He kept his eyes down because he had been taught that was the easiest way to survive a room full of strangers. He had no idea that a woman with an old-fashioned handbag and eyes as sharp as a ledger was pivoting toward him with something more dangerous than accusation, something that might undo the accusation itself. Eleanor stopped a step away and looked at the shoe with the same expression she used for family heirlooms. Slowly, she reached out and her fingers brushed the charred edge. The touch of the shoe seemed to call memory into the space between them, like a bell struck in the back of a long corridor. She inhaled just a small breath, and the smell of smoke, faint but clear, threaded its way into her mind. "You were here," she said, not loud, but with the steady authority of someone summoning history into the present. The whole room leaned, as if the air itself wanted to hear what came next. Faces turned. Amelia stiffened, and for a moment the two of them, mother and daughter, shared the weight of memory like a mirror. Richard's jaw tightened. Noah looked up, because the voice had the pull of an anchor. His eyes met Eleanor's. In them, for the first time in a long while, was not the public curiosity or the whispered suspicion, but an aged woman's certainty. Eleanor took another breath, and then, for reasons she could not explain with the tactility of her own body, she lifted her cane and rapped it once on the marble near Noah's shoe. The sound rang, small and bright, and the room fell into a hush like a theater awaiting a line. She looked at Amelia, and her face softened in a way that made the younger woman blink, disoriented. "You remember the warehouse by the river?" Eleanor asked, and Amelia opened her mouth, then closed it. There was history in that question, too much history for a simple lobby exchange. The memory hung there, unfinished, and everyone felt it as an invitation or a challenge. Noah felt the heat rush back into his cheeks, but for a different reason now. Recognition is a stranger to shame. It can dissolve it with the same strange corrosive chemistry that shame accumulates. In the hush, the shoe's small story seemed suddenly large, like a puppet's shadow filling the room. Eleanor's next words were the kind that rearranged the furniture of a day. She had been holding this information like a coin for years, and now she was ready to spend it. She could have stepped aside and whispered, corrected the inaccuracy in the privacy of Amelia's ear, done the domestic thing she did so well. But the lobby had a publicness that needed correction, and Eleanor was not a woman who deferred when injustice fitted within her reach. She said, "You were the child," looking straight at Amelia, and the air changed again. People shifted, a murmur threaded through the crowd like the clearing of a throat. Noah's mouth opened faintly. Amelia's hand went to her throat, as if to press a pulse she had not known was missing. The thing Eleanor would say next had the capacity to tilt the room, if she wanted it to. She held the moment in the way people hold a fragile glass between both hands, testing whether it will crack. She knew the next words could change a private misunderstanding into a reckoning that swept beyond them all. The truth about the burned shoe, the story of a rescue performed by a man who had chosen anonymity, a single act that had become the hinge for years of choices and for the moral shape of a company that prized image over the quietly heroic acts that sometimes looked messy. She drew a breath and began to speak, each syllable precise as a ledger. The name, the night, the details that would lift a small man out of suspicion and place him in the light of someone who had kept another's life before his own, even at the cost of being unseen. The room waited. Noah felt his pulse move like a small animal against his ribs. Amelia's face drained of color as fragments of a childhood she could not conjure clustered like mist behind her eyes. Eleanor's voice steadied. The next phrase would undo a rumor, and in the silence, people braced for a reversal that would be louder than the alarm had been. She said the name that connected them, and every person in the lobby heard it like a bell. Before the last syllable settled, Richard cleared his throat, possibly to interrupt, possibly to assert control. People murmured, leaning forward. The small camera lenses that had been thrust up lowered as if to capture the moment. Noah clutched the strap of his bag. Amelia's breath caught. Eleanor opened her mouth to finish, and then the sound of a dozen conversations simmered into a single intake. "Noah Jameson," Eleanor finished, and the name fell into the room like a dropped glass. There was a sound then, one long collective intake, and the cameras rose again in a staccato of clicks. For a moment, the lobby became two rooms at once, the one where people gossiped and speculated, and the other, thinner and harder, where a single truth had landed and changed the proportions of everything around it. Amelia's hand left her throat and went to Noah's sleeve, as if to anchor herself. Her mouth shaped the name, testing it against memory. The warehouse by the river unfolded behind her eyes. Smoke leaning against old beams, the sting of hot breath, the child she had buried under a coat she did not own, a man's arms lifting her up and out through a hole in the floor. In that remembered light, his face had been a blur. Now, before her, it sharpened. He smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. His hair was streaked with gray where it had been jet black. His hands, those hands, still bore the small, unseen calluses of work that mattered. Noah's expression did not fix into triumph or indignation. He looked as if someone had removed a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten its presence and now noticed only the space it had occupied. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "It was the night of the flood," he said, voice low, private enough that only the three of them could hear, and loud enough that the room bent to listen. Richard stepped forward, smoothing a tie he had not bothered to straighten earlier. "This is," he began, but the words came thin. He tried the procedural defense he had practiced in quieter moments, skepticism, suggestion of misremembered facts. But the practiced cadence faltered against the simple, concrete accounting of a woman who had never lied and an old woman who had kept a name. Amelia did not wait for the company's machinery of explanations. She took another step, closing the small distance between them, and for the first time in public she reached up and touched Noah's cheek with the back of her fingers, the same way one might test whether an old bruise is still tender. The contact was absurdly intimate in that lobby of polished stone. People inhaled as if at the edge of a cliff. "You saved me," she said, and there was nothing performative in it, no press-ready phrase, no rhetorical flourish. It was a private ledger settled in the middle of a crowd. Her voice broke on the last syllable. Tears pooled so quickly at the corner of her eyes that she blinked them away. Noah swallowed. "You were smaller than the shoe suggested," he managed, offering a weak attempt at levity that landed like a small stone. A few people let out nervous laughter, which died almost immediately, embarrassed at its own timing. Reporters pushed forward now, questions tumbling out. When? Why did he never tell? Did he know of the rumors? But Amelia turned to them with a steadiness that surprised everyone. "This is not for the headlines," she said. Her father opened his mouth to protest, to remind her of optics, of reputation, of the careful choreography he had maintained for years. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw not the obedient daughter who would smooth over a scandal, but a woman who had been given a truth and would not let it be folded into his ledger. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Noah, but it was also to herself, to the long decade in which suspicion had been easier than curiosity. He shrugged, a tired gesture. "I thought it would complicate things you didn't need," he said. He did not explain what things were: shame, loyalty to men he had worked for, a younger man's fear of being invisible. But the explanation hummed in the air between them. Amelia's hand tightened on his sleeve. Eleanor watched them with a small, private smile, the kind that arrives when one has finally set a long-stitched seam to rights. She tapped her cane twice more, not to command the room now, but to steady herself. "Some truths," she said, voice carrying with a strange gentleness, "are overdue." Richard's face had gone a color that suggested defeat. He cleared his throat and fled to the safer language of contingency. "There are details to verify," he said, the practiced hedging of a man who had always preferred shadows to sunlight. Amelia turned to the assembled press and employees, to the hovering cameras, to the colleagues whose gossip had helped feed a myth. "There are also things to apologize for," she said. Her voice held, "and things to fix." She looked back at Noah. "Walk with me." He met her gaze and, in the silence that followed, nodded. They moved together toward the exit, shoulders almost touching, away from the bright, expectant faces and toward the street where the river made its slow, indifferent route through the city. The crowd parted without thinking, as if the air had been instructed to make room for the two of them. As they reached the glass doors, a young reporter called out another question, about inquiries, about board statements. But Amelia did not answer. The lobby's hum returned behind them, a soft, bustling reminder of the life they had momentarily stepped out of. Outside, the light had turned soft with late afternoon. The river glinted black and silver beyond the low parapet. Noah paused on the sidewalk and turned to look at her properly. "I never wanted credit," he said. "I only wanted you safe." Amelia considered the plainness of that confession and let out a breath that was more laugh than sob.
"Então, let-me dá-lo agora," she answered. "You deserve it." They walked toward the river together, the distance between them measured now in steps rather than rumor. Behind them, the company lobby buzzed. Ahead, the warehouse along the water waited, its windows blown out and its stories still clinging to powdery brick. For Amelia, it was a place that had once contained terror, and now the origin of a truth that would shift how she saw everything she had built. Eleanor watched them go, cane resting vertical against her knee, and felt the small, steady pleasure of rightness at work. The lobby regained its conversation, but its tone had changed. Apologies and questions had more weight than whispers. Richard stood in the center of it all and felt the scaffolding he had relied upon loosen. In the slow dawning that followed, a name, the neat arrangements of the past, began to slide. Outside, Noah fell into step with Amelia, and as they walked, they spoke quietly of nothing at all, of the feel of rain on old roofs, of the exact shade of a child's shoe. And the city kept moving around them, unaware of how many things a single honest word could unsettle. The river carried on, indifferent and faithful, and in its current the past seemed less fixed, less like accusation, and more like something that might finally be laid down.